The polished mahogany of the conference table felt as cold as a morgue slab, under my hands a stark contrast to the quiet fury building in my chest. Between us sat the weapons of this war, a thick legal file and a single damningly clear photograph. My lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a man whose tailored suits were as sharp as his cross-examinations, leaned forward. His expression wasn't pitying, it was a professional caution that I respected. "Sarah, once we file this, there's no going back," he said, his voice a low hum. "The asset freeze petition is ironclad, but the blowback will be immediate and severe. Are you absolutely certain?" I let the question hang in the sterile air for a moment. My answer wasn't in words. I reached into my briefcase and retrieved the small leather case that held my real identity. I placed my detective's shield on the table. Its gold finish gleamed next to the glossy image of my father's betrayal. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a promise I was about to keep. Finish him. That promise began to form just 2 days earlier, after I returned home from a 3-week undercover operation. I was hollowed out, emotionally drained, and all I craved was the quiet comfort of my mother's presence. I let myself into the sprawling, silent house that always felt more like a museum than a home. I found her in the master bathroom, a room tiled in marble and filled with expensive perfumes. My mother, Eleanor, a woman who wore her elegance like armor, was frantically dabbing concealer onto a dark, ugly bruise blooming across her cheekbone. She jumped when she saw me, her smile as brittle as spun glass. "Honey, you're home," she chirped, the false cheeriness a familiar knife in my gut. I walked into a door, can you believe it? So clumsy. The lie hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I saw the truth in her haunted eyes, a story that the expensive makeup couldn't hide. It was the door, just like it was the slip on the stairs last Christmas, and the fall. By the pool 2 summers ago, a whole lifetime of excuses logged in my internal ledger. As I stood there, trapped between screaming and staying calm for her, my phone buzzed. A notification, a brief escape into someone else's normal life. I tapped it open, and my world tilted. The screen filled with a sun-drenched high-definition video. There was my father, Richard Jensen, a charismatic and ruthless real estate mogul, laughing without a care in the world on the deck of a yacht. He had one arm wrapped tightly around a woman half his age, his mistress, and was toasting the camera with a champagne flute. The sound of his booming laugh felt like a physical violation. The casual, public cruelty of it, his unadulterated joy set against, my mother's secret painted over shame, was a shock to the system. In that instant, something inside me didn't just break, it flash-forged itself into steel. He was laughing, celebrating his power, while my mother was hiding the evidence of his cruelty. He believed his money and his lawyers made him untouchable, but he forgot one thing. My evidence isn't presented to a board of directors. It's presented to a grand jury. To understand the case I was about to build, you have to understand the 2 families I belonged to. To understand the case I was building, you have to understand the 2 families I belonged to. One was the family of my birth, a gilded cage built on performance and perception. The other was the family I had chosen, or maybe the one that had chosen me, a world built on facts, evidence, and the relentless pursuit of truth. For most of my life, I kept a firewall between those 2 worlds. It was the only way to survive the constant, soul-crushing whiplash of being 2 completely different people. At home, I was a disappointment. At work, I was one of the most respected detectives in the organized crime and corruption unit. The memory that best explains this duality is from a family dinner about a year ago. My father was holding court at the head of our obscenely long dining table, a glass of vintage red wine in his hand. He was in his element, bragging about a new high-rise development, a monument to his own ego. I was sitting in my usual spot, quiet and observant, trying to remain as small as possible. But he always found a way to turn his spotlight on me, and it was never a flattering one. "And Sarah," he announced to the table, a smug grin on his face. "Still chasing purse snatchers, sweetie?" He loved to do this. He'd given me a belittling nickname, Officer Jenny, and he used it whenever he wanted, to remind me how little my career meant in his world of billion-dollar deals. "I keep telling you," he continued, waving his glass, "there's a cushy job in corporate security waiting for you when you get tired of playing make-believe." I took a slow breath, my knuckles white around my fork. That week, my team and I had closed a complex multi-million-dollar fraud case that had taken 6 months of sleepless nights and painstaking work. I'd just received a departmental commendation for it. For a foolish moment, I thought maybe this achievement would be big enough for him to finally acknowledge. Actually, I said, my voice steady, I just received a commendation for solving the Sterling Enterprise fraud case. He paused, took a sip of wine, and looked at me with an expression of bored amusement. It was the look that always broke my heart a little. That's nice, he said, the words dripping with condescension. He then turned to the rest of the table as if I'd said nothing at all. Did it come with a raise he tossed over his shoulder or just a gold-plated sticker? The laughter that followed felt like acid. I looked to my mother for help, for any sign of support, but she just continued her silent duty of keeping his wineglass full. Her silence was his greatest weapon against me. It was the endorsement of his cruelty, the confirmation that I was completely, utterly alone. Later that night, I found her in the kitchen, arranging flowers. I tried to talk to her, to make her understand how much it hurt. You know how your father is, she whispered, refusing to meet my eyes. He's just under a lot of pressure, honey. His world is so much bigger, so much more complex. He doesn't understand your passion, that's all. Every excuse she made felt like another brick in the wall between us. It wasn't that he didn't understand, it was that he didn't care. And her refusal to see that was a betrayal that cut deeper than any of his insults. I left that house feeling like a ghost, my biggest accomplishment reduced to a punchline. The next morning, I walked into a pre-dawn briefing room that smelled of stale coffee and adrenaline. It was my real world. 12 of the city's most hardened detectives and tactical officers were there, their eyes on me. I stood in front of a smartboard, its screen glowing with a complex wire diagram of shell corporations and offshore accounts, a hornet's nest of financial corruption. There was no condescension here. There was only focus. There was only the mission. My voice was crisp and confident, the voice of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The wiretap on the CFO confirmed it, I stated, pointing to a key note on the diagram. They're using the municipal contract as a pass-through for the laundering operation. The money trail is clean, and we have enough for a RICO predicate. Asset forfeiture is going to be our primary lever here. I scanned the faces of my team. They were with me. They trusted me. Warrants are signed, I concluded. We move on the primary location at 0500. From the back of the room, my commanding officer, Captain Eva Rostova, a formidable veteran, who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing, gave a single sharp nod. She didn't need a long speech. She saw my work, she knew my results, and she believed in me. Your play, Jensen, she said, her voice full of gravel and absolute confidence. Bring them down. That was it. Those 5 words were more validation than my own father had given me in 30 years. In that room, I wasn't Officer Jenny. I was Detective Jensen. I was the one who saw the patterns no one else could, the one who connected the dots, the one they trusted to lead them into the fire. The respect in that room was palpable. It was earned, and it was real. It was the complete antithesis of the hollow, performative world my father had built for himself. For years, I had kept my 2 worlds separate to keep the peace. But his war had finally come to my mother's doorstep. He only respected the language of leverage and consequences. So I decided it was time I spoke to him in the only language he'd ever truly understand. The rage I felt when I saw that video. It was a wildfire. But wildfires burn out. What was left in its place was something far more dangerous. A cold, clear, and methodical purpose. My objectives were now perfectly aligned, running on 2 parallel tracks that I knew would eventually converge with devastating force. The first track was civil, get my mother out, secure her future, and strip him of the assets he used as a shield. The second track was criminal, make him accountable for the crimes I had always suspected he was committing, using his own corruption as the weapon against him. I started with the civil case. In a meeting with my lawyer, Marcus, I wasn't just a grieving daughter, I was his lead investigator. He was an expert in divorce law, but I was an expert in my father. I spread out a series of notes on his conference table. Don't just ask for his tax returns, I told Marcus, my voice level. He has teams of accountants to hide things there. We need to go deeper. Subpoena the flight manifests for his private jet and the incorporation. Documents for all offshore LLCs he's established in the last 5 years. I slid the photo of the yacht across the table. And get the purchase agreement for that. His ego is his biggest vulnerability. He puts everything in writing, assuming no one is smart enough to ever find it. While Marcus began drafting the subpoenas that would act as our battering ram, I started on the criminal track. That photo of the yacht wasn't just proof of his infidelity for me, it was a lead. Back at the precinct, I used my credentials to access the International Maritime Registry. The yacht's registration was a dead end at first, leading to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. But that's my specialty, unraveling shell games. It took me 2 days of digging through financial databases, but I found the link. The corporation was funded by a massive wire transfer from a contractor who, just weeks earlier, had been awarded a suspicious multi-million-dollar city zoning variance by a committee my father had personally lobbied. It was the thread. The one I always knew was there. This was no longer just a daughter's pain. This was a detective with probable cause. I took my initial findings to Captain Rostova. To maintain the integrity of the case, I had to be careful. I laid out the connection between the contractor and the suspicious zoning deal, presenting the information as coming from a new, highly reliable confidential informant. She listened intently, her eyes never leaving mine. She could probably sense the personal current running beneath the professional surface, but she was a woman who trusted my instincts above all else. When I was finished, she simply nodded. "Handle it, Jensen," she said, her voice firm. "By the book. Make it stick." It was the only green light I needed. My father received the first round of legal notices from Marcus and scoffed, calling it an emotional shakedown. He fired back with his team of corporate bulldogs. He thought he was preparing for a messy divorce. He had no idea he was a primary target in a federal corruption investigation. The deposition room was chosen to be his territory, a sterile top-floor conference room in a skyscraper downtown, all glass and steel, designed to intimidate. It was a world of hushed tones and $1,000 suits, the kind of place where my father had always written the rules. He made his entrance flanked by 2 of the city's most expensive corporate lawyers, radiating an arrogant confidence that was second nature to him. He was smiling, a predator walking into what he believed was his own den. He shot a smirk in our direction, a look that dismissed me as an irrelevance and my mother as a temporary inconvenience. My mother, sitting beside me, was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but her spine was straight. She was terrified, but she was resolute. I, on the other hand, felt nothing but a profound and unnerving calm. The storm was over. This was the reckoning. Marcus began the proceedings, his voice the epitome of professional courtesy. He started with the basics, asking routine questions about declared assets, stock portfolios, and real estate holdings. My father leaned back in his chair, a picture of relaxed condescension. He lied with the casual ease of a man who had been doing it his entire life, denying the existence of offshore accounts and deflecting questions about extravagant gifts with practiced ease. His lawyers would occasionally interject with a procedural objection, but mostly they just sat there, confident that this was all just a prelude to a settlement negotiation. I remained silent, watching him, letting him build his own cage, lie by lie. Then, Marcus brought up the yacht. "And the vessel your client was photographed on the weekend of May 10th? He asked, his tone unchanged. My father actually chuckled. "Ah, yes, that," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "A beautiful boat. It was a one-time rental for a corporate event. A business expense." He looked directly at me when he said it, a glint of cruel victory in his eyes. He thought he was untouchable, that his version of reality was the only one that mattered. He was comfortable in the gray areas, in the world of plausible deniability. He had no idea I operated in a world of black and white, of evidence. Marcus paused, held my gaze for a fraction of a second, and then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was my turn. I leaned forward, the leather of my chair groaning softly in the silent room. I placed a thin, official-looking file on the polished table. The sound it made, a soft, definitive thud, drew every eye. I spoke for the very first time, and the sound of my voice, calm and authoritative, seemed to change the air pressure in the room. "Mr. Jensen," I began, using his formal name, a name I had never used before. "Let's talk about the yacht, the Sea Serpent." It wasn't rented. It was purchased on May 4th through a Cayman Islands LLC, funded by a wire transfer from a contractor, who 1 week later was granted the zoning exception for your downtown tower project. A sudden, sharp intake of breath from one of his lawyers was the only sound. My father's smile faltered, confusion clouding his features. His lead counsel, a bulldog of a man, finally found his voice and shot to his feet. "Objection. This is a divorce deposition, not a criminal inquiry," he boomed, pointing a finger at me. "This is wildly inappropriate. Who do you think you are?" The question hung in the air. The question he had been asking me my entire life with his dismissive glances and condescending nicknames. I slowly opened the file in front of me. The top page was a federal warrant, my signature clearly visible on the bottom line. I reached into my jacket, took out my gold detective's shield, and slid it across the vast empty space of the table. It spun once, a flash of gold under the recessed lighting, before coming to a stop directly in front of my father. "I'm Detective Sarah Jensen," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the badge itself. "Lead investigator for the joint FBI-NYPD Task Force on Public Corruption." I looked past him to his stunned lawyer. "And your client's non-answers just became material omissions to a federal agent. This deposition is over." I then locked my eyes onto my father's. "But my criminal interview is just beginning." The color drained from his face. It was instantaneous and absolute, like a switch had been flipped. The arrogant smirk, the confident posture, the cruel glint in his eye, it all vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at the badge, then his eyes flickered up to my face. And I could see it. I could see the moment he finally saw me. Not his disappointing daughter, not Officer Jenny playing make-believe. He saw the architect of his ruin. All his power, all his money, all his lawyers, they were useless. His bravado didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind a hollowed-out old man who was finally, truly, afraid. He looked to his lawyers for help, but they were pale, speechless, staring at me as if I had just morphed into a different being right before their eyes. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably conquered. For my entire life, he had been the most powerful man in every room he entered. But in this room, on this day, he wasn't a CEO or a mogul. He was just a suspect. And I was the law. In the moments that followed, the high-priced lawyers my father had surrounded himself with were reduced to a frantic, whispering mess. They scrambled with papers and cell phones, trying to formulate a strategy where none existed. My father himself said nothing. He just sat there, a hollowed-out man, staring at the golden shield on the table, as if it were a bomb that had already detonated. He didn't look at me again. I didn't need him to. I stood up slowly, the scrape of my chair the only loud sound in the room. I walked over to my mother, took her hand, and gently pulled her to her feet. We walked out of that room together, leaving the quiet chaos and the ruins of his empire behind us without a single backward glance. The door clicked shut, and a lifetime of pain was finally locked on the other side. 8 months later, I was in my apartment after a long shift, watching the late-night news. A local segment came on, and I saw his face, a tired gray booking photo that was a ghost of the powerful man he once was. The reporter summarized the case in sterile, objective terms. Richard Jensen had pleaded guilty to federal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. As part of the plea deal, he had forfeited millions of dollars in assets to the state and was sentenced to 10 years in a federal correctional facility. Watching it, I didn't feel a surge of victory or a thirst for revenge being quenched. I just felt quiet. It was simply the logical conclusion. An equation had been solved. A case had been closed. My mother's new life was where the real victory could be found. I went to visit her one sunny afternoon at the small community art center she had opened. Downtown, a lifelong dream that had been perpetually dismissed as a silly hobby. I found her in a bright, sunlit studio that smelled of turpentine and fresh paint. She was laughing, her hands covered in streaks of cobalt blue and cadmium yellow, as she helped a student with their canvas. She looked 10 years younger, the fragile, haunted look in her eyes completely gone, replaced by a deep, genuine peace. She had used her fair divorce settlement, the money she was rightfully owed, to build something beautiful from the ashes. She was creating, not just surviving. She was free. My own life had found a new center of gravity as well. My work had always been my sanctuary, but now it was also my legacy. I stood in my new office, larger with a view of the city, and looked at the freshly mounted plaque on the wall. It read, Lieutenant Sarah Jensen. Captain Rostova, who was now my deputy chief, came in and put a thick, heavy file on my new desk. Got a big one for you, Lieutenant, she said, a small, proud smile on her face. A city councilman, a construction firm, and a pension fund that's been bled dry. They asked for our best. I picked up the file, the weight of the responsibility feeling like an honor, not a burden. This was my family now, my purpose. About a month after that, a letter arrived at my apartment. The return address was a federal penitentiary. It was from him. I stood in my kitchen and opened it, my heart rate steady. The first line was all I needed to read. It wasn't an apology, but a bitter accusation filled with self-pity and blame for how I had ruined his life. I stopped reading. I thought to myself that maybe a year ago, this letter would have destroyed me. It would have been the final, cruel twist of the knife. But now, it was just paper. Without any ceremony, I walked over to the small paper shredder by my desk and fed the letter into it. I turned my back on the angry, whining noise as it did its work, my healing no longer dependent on his acknowledgement or his apology. My father built an empire to insulate himself from consequences. I used the law to give him the one thing he could no longer afford, the truth. If you've ever had to become the protector your family needed, tell us your story below. In this community, your strength is always recognized.